Now there are pictures of me back in the day. The point is, I like music from the very start. The story that my dad used to tell is that when I was about 6 months old, I would cry at night, and he would carry me, and he would sing "Jesus Loves Me" to me. And he realized one night that the humming sounds I was making was me trying to sing the tune back. And I'd get some notes right, and I go hmm, and then I get the next one wrong, and then I'd stop. I'd start over again.
And that hasn't changed.
And
that hasn't changed.
Well, I've got the tune now, but this is 6 months. So they said, "Oh, music! Let's make music available to him." So by age 4, I was listening repeatedly to Beethoven's Appassionata, the F minor piano sonata. We had that recording. Bum ba bum ba bum ba, and I just went nuts over the thing. He'd pound the piano, bum 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 bum, which he's angry, and then he gets quiet and he's scared. And I understood that as a kid, and I knew that I was going to be a composer. Who wouldn't want to make up these sounds? So here I am pretending to play the piano on the cistern in the backyard. I also listened to Nutcracker Suite. That was kind of fun. Strauss's Till Eulenspiegel. This is at age 4. I knew I was going to be a composer. Now we didn't have a piano back then. I didn't get a piano until about age 9, which is a little late to start.
Me too.
And as soon as I started learning notation, I tried writing my stuff down. Here's an example of some sketch, root position, C major triad, all of the notational errors. I'm just trying to do something, after about 2 weeks of training.
It's pretty good. That's pretty good.
I'm sorry?
That's very good.
Oh, it's very good. Well, it gets better. Fortunately, it gets better. By this time, about age 10, I was already familiar with most of the classical repertoire on recording. And then at age 10, my father started bringing home recordings of 20th century music. And it was like the light bulb went off. I loved it. It's like, you've been keeping the good stuff from me until now. My particular favorites were Vaughan Williams and Bartók. I still think Vaughan Williams symphonies are a very powerful statement. I listened to Debussy, Lemaire, but also the violin sonata, his last work. That was very interesting. Stravinsky. Ballet. The early ballets were fun. I didn't think Rite of Spring was particularly challenging. It was just, it made sense to me. Bartók is my other favorite. I didn't get the hold of the string quartets until a few years later, but music for strings, and especially the concerto for orchestra. Now that stretched me a bit. That was about as much as I could take stylistically. But I was convinced that the concerto for orchestra was the best work ever written. This would have been around 1961. That work was less than 20 years old at the time. This was still new music. This was contemporary music for its time.
Richard, did you mention what your parents did, or were they musicians?
They weren't musicians per se. My dad had taken a music appreciation class in college and loved classical music, and he sang. He was a fundamentalist minister, so he sang in a gospel quartet, and there were some recordings around. There was somebody in the extended family who had a large collection of 78 RPM records, the old, not LP records, but the old fast turntable speed records. I was allowed to listen to those. But around Around age 10, I was puzzled by 12-tone music. My dad brought home an LP recording of Schoenberg's piano concerto with some of the solo piano pieces. The solo piano pieces a little more sense, but I was really puzzled by the piano concerto. But I knew from my reading that Schoenberg was important, and I wanted to understand it. Years later, I realized that there is a disconnect. There's one reason that there's a problem with Schoenberg's music in particular. He was steeped in classical form and classical rhythms, and he uses classical rhythms that imply tonal function. And antecedent consequent phrases, for instance, that imply dominant tonic, or a cadential rhythmic pattern that implies some sort of a dominant tonic cadence, and the pitches are not giving you that. So the music is sending mixed signals. I still think that's a basic flaw. You might say he didn't go far enough. He innovated in the area of pitch, but he didn't innovate in the area of rhythm. I mentioned this to Charles Rosen, the famous pianist and author on music. This was during my university years. He was giving a lecture and he asked for questions from the audience. And I mentioned this theory of mine. He said, yeah, exactly. And he immediately played the opening of the Schoenberg Piano Concerto from memory to illustrate the point. Then he looked at me and said, that young man is a very astute observation. Around age 14, a few years later, Alvin Berg's quasi-romanticism started to make sense, and then Schoenberg started to make sense. And then I became fascinated with Webern. I ordered the Robert Kraft recording of the complete Webern, and I just immersed myself in Webern. So by about age 16, I was writing my own 12-tone pieces. And I look back on these manuscripts in my teen years now, and I think they're surprisingly competent, accomplished for a teenager. I mean, these are viable pieces, and they were starting to win student competition prizes. Here's an example that won first prize in Music Teachers Association in California, using a tone row. In high school, I sang in the choir. That's me in the upper left corner in the Madrigal group. And I still like to sing in choirs. I sing when we're not shut down by pandemic, I sing in my my church choir, which is a rather accomplished choir. It helps me stay in touch with performance of live music. The choir director at high school nurtured me. She was very sympathetic. About 4 years ago, I went back to Huntington Beach High School for a memorial service for the director. She had long been gone from the high school by then for decades, but they held a memorial service. And I was surprised to find that Huntington Beach High School no longer has any music programs. There's no groups, there's no band. What they have is a recording studio where students can learn to record their guitar pieces and ship them off to pop venues. That's the extent of the music, quote unquote, program in high school. Choir director's husband was a composer who taught at Cal State Long Beach. His name was Robert Tyndall. This is before I could drive. He started taking me up to Monday evening concerts in Los Angeles, the 20th century, the new music concert series. He introduced me to the local composition professors at USC and UCLA. I remember in particular one concert where we heard the Koncharsky brothers play Stockhausen's complete piano music. Pierre Boulez was in the audience that night, and I got to meet him and got his autograph. I collected a lot of autographs, by the way. I met a lot of composers and got their autographs. Look at that first one, Roy Harris, 1966. I took master piano classes from Harris's wife, Joanna, who in her time was an accomplished concert pianist. She invited me to an orchestra rehearsal to meet Roy, and I got this personalized autograph from him. Other autographs include Aaron Copland. That squiggle up at the upper right is Darius Milhaud from 1967. William Schumann, more on that later. Mel Powell, Ernst Krenek, Lucas Voss, John Cage, Milton Babbitt, Luciano Berio, Vito Lidoslavsky, Henri Dutilleux, Peter Maxwell Davies, Harrison Birtwistle, Alexander Gare, Hans Werner Henze, Christoph Penderecki, Olivier Messiaen. I had a great time.
What were they like? I would love to hear.
Well, in most of these cases, they were very quick interactions after concerts, you know, and they just sign and run off. Some of them I got to chat with, and I'll talk about a couple of them as we go on. Cage was very polite and very kind of withdrawn, I would say. In my senior year in high school, I decided on my own that I would write a piece for my high school choir to the familiar text, "To Everything There's a Season" from Ecclesiastes. It's modal, it's tonal. The choir director was enthusiastic and programmed it on our concerts. And not only that, she had us sing it at a festival where we were in competition with the other choirs. And the adjudicator, who was Marion Vree from Pierce College in San Fernando Valley, said, "I really like this student's piece. Do you mind if I send it to my publisher?" So a few days later, I got a contract in reply from Lawson Gould Music Publishers, subsidiary of G. Schirmer. The piece was actually published 2 years later in 1971. So let's listen to that piece. Now the sound quality is very poor because this is 1969, Huntington Beach High School choir. It's been transferred from tape to tape, etc. Gene Tyndall conducting, and I'm in the bass section somewhere. Wow. I was accepted at the University of California, Santa Barbara with a 4-year Regents scholarship, which is about the only way I could go to college. And not only that, but I entered the undergraduate College of Creative Studies, which at the time was only about 3 years old. It's still going strong now. The premise behind creative studies is that students who are already doing advanced creative work in the arts or sciences should get one-on-one tutoring rather than having to wait till late in the senior year. So I had weekly composition lessons for 4 years. In order to accomplish this, some but not all of the generalization requirements are lifted, make room for the classwork in creative studies. And then all creative studies classes are pass-fail. So there's no judgment on the quality of the creative work. You can run experiments, you can fail. It's all about advancing your creative work. It's been a very successful program in many fields. I studied with the English composer Peter Racine Fricker, who had come a couple of years earlier to teach creative studies. And he was very useful, especially in terms of introducing us to English musicians. In about my third year, I abandoned composing with tone rows. I said, you know, this is methodical, it's mechanical, it restricts intuitive inspiration. It cranks out content. And so I had a sort of a stylistic rejuvenation. And I started to write more pieces. In early 1971, I wrote my sonata for flute and piano. I remember Peter Fricker saying, you know, I think you got something good here. It was played by faculty members Burnett Atkinson and Emmylou Deemer. Emmylou is the well-known choral composer. She's 92 years old right now, still in Santa Barbara. She pretty much sight read anything, which is why she played my piano music. And it won second prize in class 1 of the National Federation of Music Clubs Young Composers Contest. I started winning several times. I won the national level student awards. Two of these movements were played at our recent NACUSA-LA concert a couple years ago with Mary Palchik on flute and then Sebastian Chang on piano. And let's listen to the beginning of that second movement, the sonata form. This is them playing. And it goes into the second theme, secondary sonata form. Wow. Now, I remained at UC Santa Barbara for my doctoral work. For the PhD, not least because they gave me a Regents Fellowship for my years there. My 5 pieces for orchestra were performed by the University Orchestra, and I taught composition in the College of Creative Studies as a graduate student, as well as classes that I would put together on topics like the symphony in the 20th century, 12-tone developments, Bartók's string quartets. My students that I'm in touch with now tell me that Bartók class was the one that really helped them the most in understanding just what the possibilities there are in new music composition. Some of you know Jack Van Zandt, a prominent Southern California composer. He was my student. He was my composition student in creative studies classes. In 1975, I won a BMI award to student composers, Broadcast Music Incorporated. So I was flown back to New York City for the ceremony where I met the American composer, William Schumann. Schumann was the sponsor of the BMI Awards. It was kind of his program. And I told him at the reception I was a fan of his music and that for a few months I had imitated his style. And he didn't know how to take that, okay. And then I told him, I remarked that the first 2 movements of his then fairly recent 8th Symphony, written in '68, were simply orchestrations of the first 2 movements of his 4th string quartet. And I wondered what the meaning was behind that. I thought maybe there was some programmatic significance or something. To my surprise, he became defensive. He said, composers do that. I mean, Brahms used his music, Bach used it. There's nothing wrong with using your music. And I thought, oops. He ran out of inspiration or time on the commission or both and is embarrassed. Okay. During this photo shoot, he was muttering to me, you can see his mouth going, stand up straight, chest out, big smile. He was trying to teach me how to be a public figure. So that's me throwing my chest out and smiling for the camera. In early 1976, I taught a class on the music of Elliott Carter. Some of you have heard the story from my session on Carter. I'd been studying a lot of advanced music, and a lot of it was very interesting, but it also seemed gimmicky to me. I'm talking about things like Xenakis, Luciano Berio, etc. And I began to read, in my doctoral studies, I began to read Carter's essays, and they made sense to me. He was saying the same things. He wasn't afraid to call out avant-garde techniques as gimmicks. I thought, I need to pay more attention to his music. I went to his music, and I began to realize it's expressive, it's consistent, it's logical, it's not system generated. It's a good way of extending the language of music in a logical and yet expressive way. And it solved a lot of the creative problems that face contemporary composers. So I put together an in-depth class on Carter for creative studies students. And I mean, we went into depth on the scores. We analyzed those scores in depth. So happens that Carter was in Southern California for a week in April of '76, hosted by Cal Arts down in Valencia. His double concerto, the harpsichord and piano, was played at Monday evening concerts. We all went down for that. So I wrote to Cal Arts. I said, look, I've got about 6 students in a class that I'm teaching on Carter. Could we come down to meet him? And they wrote back, sure, come down on the Friday, because it's sort of an open day, nothing much scheduled that day. Now, the Scottish composer Thea Musgrave had just started teaching in creative studies. Peter Fricker had brought her in. She's still alive. She's now 92 years old. And we just happened to sit together at a concert, and she asked me, how's your Carter class going? And I told her about the Cal Arts letter. She said, if it's a free day, I wonder if we could get him to come up here and give a talk. I said, you know Carter? She goes, Elliot and Helen? Oh, pish tosh, you know. So she calls him at home in Manhattan the next day, and he says, sure, I'll come to Santa Barbara. So she says, okay, Richard, here's what I want you to do. Do not take whatever beat up student car you have. Check out a university sedan from the carpool, drive down to Valencia, pick him up, bring him up, check him into the hotel in Goleta, and then meet me at the faculty club for lunch. I had him in the car for 2.5 hours. We had a great time. We bonded, we talked about everything, you know. A few days later, I wrote down a detailed account of our discussion so I wouldn't forget. And just recently, about 3 years ago, it was published online in the Elliott Carter Studies Journal, which is an online journal. His talk was very successful. I had 6 students or so, well over 150 people in attendance. Essentially, the music department shut down to hear Carter. And you could hear gasps of awe at some of the points he was quietly making. One woman on my doctoral committee was a specialist in 19th century Romantic music. And she said, I want to thank you for whatever role you played in bringing him here. She says, I think that was the best talk we have ever had here. She said, how much did Creative Studies pay him? I said, $500. She said, you could have put a 0 at the end of that and it would have been a bargain. A few days later, he wrote me a letter through the college saying essentially that that's the letter over there on the right, I was one of the few who really understood his music and that he wanted to keep in touch. So he wrote a letter of recommendation for my academic file. Over the years, I have about 12 letters from him. Wow. And we would try to see each other whenever we were in the same city, which wasn't that often. At the end of my doctoral studies, I had, in 1977-78, I had a Fulbright fellowship. I studied with Justin Connolly at the Royal College of Music in London. Connolly was Peter Ficker's former student. Peter says, I think you would do well studying with him. He just died a few months ago, back in the fall. And I had a wonderful time during the year. I mean, I attended a lot of concerts and met a lot of those composers I mentioned in the autograph list. Carter's 70th birthday celebrations were there. He wrote me and says, hey, I'm going to be there. Let's get together. I took, sightseeing trips. I would say it was the best year of my life, but I hadn't met my wife yet, so I can't officially say that, right? But now, my doctoral dissertation piece was a symphony, number 1. And I showed it to Justin. He took one look at it and says, we have to play this. I said, really? Yeah. He said, these are very good students here. These are the best students in the country. The students at the Royal Academy of Music across town would disagree, but So we went to Sir David Wilcox, the famous choral conductor. He was the head of the college at the time. The rumor is that they had cut a deal with him. He would get his knighthood if he agreed to leave the Royal College of Music for a minimum of 3 years. So my year there was his first year there, and he spent his 3 years and then immediately left. So he agreed. He says, yeah, look, I'll conduct the Fauré Requiem in the first part of the concert in the spring, and then Justin will conduct your symphony. So Justin and I spent the next few months extracting the parts by hand. Everything was done in manuscript back then, right? And it was performed by the first orchestra of the college on February 23rd, 1978. I was experimenting a lot with free notation, something that I don't do much, but you'll see some of that in the beginning of the symphony that I'm going to play. And this, again, the sound quality is poor because this is the performance from the Royal College of Music in 1978. Now that passage, it ends with this sample ends with where the individual pizzicato string instruments are playing repeated patterns of different lengths and then repeating them over and over again. This is straight out of Ludoslavsky. The day I met Carter, I said, you know, I agree with you. Most of these avant-garde things are gimmicky and not that practical. They're more about getting attention. But I said, what about Ludoslavsky's method of allowing little passages to repeat against each other? It seems like an interesting way to free up the texture a little. Carter said, no, I disagree. He said, and my main complaint with what Ludoslavsky does is that whenever he does that, he relinquishes harmonic control. And I thought, bingo, you're right. Because paradoxically, the effect is suddenly the music harmonically becomes static. It circles around. He says, that's very important to me, to move the music forward harmonically. I don't want to give that up. Anyway, moving right along. I returned to California the end of the year, got my doctorate. I started interviewing for teaching positions. I interviewed at Harvard for a one-year sabbatical replacement position, State University of New York at Geneseo, Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, among other things. But nobody came through. Eventually, I just developed a business career to support my music habit. And when I told Carter that I was no longer looking for a university job, he said, "I think you're better off." I said, "Yeah, right." He goes, "No, I'm serious. I think as a composer, you are better off outside academia," which I think is a very interesting comment. I see his point. You know, you're not ingrown in a little circle of people who play each other's pieces. You know, you have to make it on your own. The downside, the problem is, unless you make an effort to keep in touch with musicians, you get isolated. And I didn't handle that well for about 10, 15 years. But I kept writing music. I got married to Charlene. Around 1980, Carter asked me to write an article about his music for Perspectives of New Music. He said they wrote him and said they wanted a piece on his music. And he said, "I want Richard Derby to write it." So I decided to write an analysis of the duo for violin and piano from 1974. It was relatively new at the time. There was nothing in the literature yet on it. It was released in the 81-82 issue of Perspectives. Carter wrote me a letter saying how good it was in comparison to the verbose, rarefied stuff in the rest of the issue. He says, "I don't know how you can stand all this academic crap." Over the years, younger Carter scholars have told, when I meet them, they tell me how much that article has meant to them, which is very gratifying. 1985, my chamber concerto was awarded the American New Music Consortium Prize. It was written from 1977 to 1979. It was begun under Justin Connolly's tutelage at the Royal College of Music. So it was started as my Fulbright project. Justin told me how much he admired the work. He said, "I wish I'd written it." And he tried to get it played, and Britain was frustrated that he couldn't get it played. The award was supposed to include a performance in New York City and publication by the prominent French music publisher Edition Salbert. Long story short, neither performance nor publication took place. I finally got to talk to one of the committee on the phone who said, "It's just too difficult. If you want your music performed, you should make it as easy as possible so that the cost of rehearsals is minimized, etc." Well, I disagree with that. I think music should be practical, but it can also be a challenge to performers and to listeners in order to be meaningful. There's nothing wrong with stretching yourself and musicians and listeners. This concerto is frankly far less difficult and uses far more traditional notation than many avant-garde pieces that were in fact being played and published at the time. So go figure. Let's listen to a little bit of this extracted from Sibelius and see what you think. chamber concerto.
This is a good idea with naming the beats there.
Those, the little cues.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I occasionally use if I want to free up notation a little bit.
Mhm.
You can use cues to show where the conductor's beats are, but then the performer sort of organizes the notes in relation to that.
Mhm.
I find free notation is a little more difficult if there's more than one performer playing. Southwest Chamber Music was founded in 1987 in Pasadena. In 1990, they played Carter's duo for violin and piano, the piece I'd written the article on. I saw the ad in the paper and I said, what kind of group has the balls to attempt this piece? I've got to go hear this. They're going to screw it up. And they did a fabulous job with it. Gloria Chang was the pianist and played it quite well. And I told her afterwards, you played that really well. And then she listened appreciatively afterwards as I described the processes in the piece. So that's very helpful, Richard. Thank you. In 1990, a couple months later, at the Ojai Festival was dedicated to Carter's music. And he thanked me for all the people who reported that they've been talking with me recently about his music. In 1992, Southwest Chamber Music sponsored Carter for 6 weeks in a sort of residency. They brought him out. At one of the concerts, Carter asked me how my music was doing. And I told him, frankly, I'm just writing it and putting it away. I'm putting it on the shelf. And he was horrified. He said, you cannot do that, Richard. You must not do that. At the very next Southwest Chamber Music concert, Jeff Vonderschmidt, the artistic director, came up to me and said, hey, what can we play of yours? So he said, what can I play? He played French horn. So I said, well, I can write a brief horn solo. And that'd be great. I gave it to him. He said, yeah, I programmed it on Southwest Chamber Music concerts. Many years later, he told me, Richard, this is the best horn solo I know. And I play them all. It's simply the best. Next, he asked me for a big duo for horn and piano. That took a couple of years to write, and it got programmed on their music programs. By now, this is the mid-90s, 1990s. We then agreed together that I would write a quintet for flute using the late Dorothy Stone on flute, strings, and piano. And it was played on Southwest Chamber Music concerts in the late 1990s. About that time, they received a grant to record their Composer's Portrait series of CDs on Cambria Master recordings. One of the CDs released in 2000 was dedicated to my 3 pieces for them. So let's listen to the climax of the quintet off the Southwest Chamber Music CD. Wow. Very dense textures, of course. Full screen. So about that time, Jeff admitted to me that what had happened, that Carter had come to them in 1992 and said, "You need to play Richard's music." And you don't say no to Elliott Carter. Says, "Okay, I mean, we're not in the habit of picking our audience members out." And and lo and behold, it worked out. They also played an early flute solo of mine, and then they commissioned a solo for their string player, bass player, Tom Peters. 9/11 had just happened. So in 2003, I wrote a memorial to the victims of 9/11 for Tom. It got strong audience reaction because of the subject matter, and a very positive review in the LA Times. Now we'll wrap up soon. Recent developments. Around 2000, my technique freed up even some more and my output increased. In 2007, I wrote a concerto for orchestra, which was performed in 2009 by the student orchestra at UC Irvine, Stephen Tucker conducting. In 2008, I wrote a tuba solo called Night Fog for Michael Music's master degree recital at USC in February 2009. Around 2010, I met Dion Nielsen Price and joined NACUSA-LA, and the rest is history, right? Got involved in the chapter. The Locrian chamber players played in New York City, played the scherzo for my third string quartet in New York in August of 2019. This is the same movement that was played by the Lyrist Quartet at our NACUSA-LA concert in honor of Frank Campo. At the Locrian chamber players concert, I met the guitarist Oren Fader, who asked me for songs for the duo he has with his mezzo-soprano wife. So I wrote 2 songs to my wife's poems. My wife's a very accomplished poet. For the Bowers-Fader duo, which they love and have performed on 2 streamed concerts already so far. The Boston New Music Initiative has played several pieces of mine in the last year. There I am in Boston in February of 2020, just before the shutdown. And that pretty much brings us up to current times. Now, when Adrienne Albert gave her talk on her music, she was asked, do you write diatonic music? Is that a calculated effort to gain exposure? And she said, no, this is who I am. My music reflects who I am, which is a great answer. And I would say the same thing about my music. I'm writing the best music I can. I only have one life, and I'm trying to write the music that means something to me. I'm not interested in simplifying the content or style to make it more accessible. I try to make it practical. I feel very strongly that it needs to be practical, but also it needs to be consistent to what I think is important. And I'm not really in the business to make money. I mean, I made money in business, and it supports my music habit. And in a way, like Carter was hinting, in a way that might be a good way to go, at least sometimes. Now that probably generates opinions and commentary, but what do you think?
What do you think about Roger Reynolds? Do you know his stuff?
Remind me, I remember the name.
He, I think, started as an engineer.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think he was in San Diego also.
Yes, that's right. I was in Santa Barbara.
Okay, yeah.
He was in San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Fairney taught in San Diego.
Right.
Yeah, I don't remember Reynolds' music.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Carter, Duteyo, I was interested in Maxwell Davis, at least some of the music. You know, they're various, Alexander Gare. That's who Jack Van Zandt went to study with after he got his BA in creative studies. He went to Cambridge. Peter Fricker set him up with Alexander Gare in Cambridge. That's where he really grew.
I actually performed a piece of Alexander Gare at the Monday evening concerts many years ago. Yeah. I must say, Richard, I am so impressed. I'm so kind of overwhelmed to hear your music and to get to know you in this way. And it's so interesting to me that you started out loving Ralph Vaughan Williams and Bartok, and then you migrated or emigrated to Carter and to what you hear and what you love. And I really am very, very impressed. Thank you. Thank you for all you're doing. It's wonderful.
Who do you listen to now, Richard?
You know, I don't listen to much music anymore.
Either. I don't either.
I don't know if that's a problem. I mean, I know so much of it already, but I'm composing so much. You know, I'm writing a lot of music nowadays, and I don't know. I mean, I still go to concerts, you know, when there are virtual concerts these days. Waiting for somebody to ask me what pop music I like.
I'm just wondering how come the audience is so big at the Locrian concert there.
It was the rehearsal.
I'm just kidding.
The pre-concert rehearsal.
It's a joke.
It was the third set on Sunday.
But I mean, the audience was about 30 people, which is not unusual for a new music concert. You know, on a good day, that's what NACUSA-LA brings in, right?
It's true.
At least it's not Chicago style.
How's that?
There was a saxophone player in New York named Frank West, and at one time we were just playing with some friends at a nightclub, and there were a few people in the audience, and there may be more people on stage. And he had an unusual voice. And he say, "Oh, this is Chicago style." I said, "Well, what's that?" He says, "That's when the musicians could challenge the audience to a fight and whoop them."
Andy, did Frank West play with Basie?
For about 12 years, he played with Count Basie.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I knew him. I mean, I met him.
Yes, he was an unusual person, and New York will never be the same now that he's gone.
Yeah.
I think he'd be 99 this year. I think he was born in 22.
Wow. Wow.
He
Amazing.
just left us fairly recently. I mean, he was in his early 90s.
Brilliant musician.
And still well, but he had lost his eyesight. And, you know, people would ask him how he was doing, and he would say, "Yeah, I just need to get a CNI dog that could read music and tap its foot."
Richard, I think it's amazing that you were listening to such awesome stuff when you were so small, because that's totally different background than I came from.
I would say that's a very, very unusual experience, probably, you know, but that's what I was doing. I just was listening to all this music.
Richard, were you familiar with a composer called Raoul Pleskow?
No.
He was a disciple and a student of Stefan Volpe.
Oh.
And he taught, he had Volpe's old job at Long Island University for many years, where he taught probably from the 50s through the 80s. And he was one of those people that would write a piece of music, often 12-tone or aleatoric, and it could be for a large ensemble, and then put it in the drawer and then write another one.
Yeah.
And rarely had performances, but his head was always in the next piece. He didn't always realize what was going on Earth, but in his mind for music. You know, he would say to his students, and what we assumed was a mock Viennese accent by this point, because he'd been in New York so long. But are we walking toward or away from the canteen? And away from, Professor Plaskow. Oh, good. That means I ate already. Okay.
Highly of Stefan Volpe. He recommended Volpe, said he learned from him.
Yeah, Volpe had also taught at LIU for many years. So pretty much every music teacher in public school on Long Island had done their master's degree at LIU and had studied with Volpe. I mean, when I was growing up, they had all gone through his classes.
Yeah. Carter says, I don't much enjoy teaching. He says, I do it at Juilliard because they seem to want it.
Is it true that he said that he didn't really like modern music, but his wife liked it, so he kept writing it? Or was that? I'm sure he was saying that to be funny, but he was quoted as saying that to some people.
No, that's not.
He must have been trying to be glib. Well, she likes it, so.
He was, as a young boy, he was in the audience at the first New York City performance of The Rite of Spring.
Wow.
Believe that.
What year would that have been?
Well, it was after the war. It was after, he was born in 1908.
Okay.
The war ended, when was it, 18? No. So he would have been about 10 or something.
Amazing.
I talked a few years ago, I was introduced to Virgil Blackwell, who was the Carter's personal assistant in the last years. Carter died at age 103 and 11 months. Got his life's worth, his money's worth out of it. And Virgil told me the story of his final days. He said there were three things that happened. One is that Carter received the Légion d'honneur from France, their top award, and he lived in France, studied with Nadia Boulanger in the 1930s. So he went to the embassy in New York to receive the award, threw away his prepared comments and extemporized in flawless French, but it tired him out at age 103. He came home tired. And then he contracted pneumonia and was in the hospital. And in his old age, he was a little cranky, and he wasn't cooperating with the doctors. And Virgil told him finally, "Do you want out of here on your own terms?" "Yes." "You have to do what they say." "Okay." And then he came home to recuperate, and then the hurricane hit New York City. I forget the name of it, but the power was out. Yeah, the power was out, and he couldn't get warm in the apartment in Greenwich Village in southern Manhattan. And they couldn't evacuate him because the elevator wasn't working. Virgil said he finally just stopped eating, which is what you do, I guess.
What was the last piece that he completed, and at what age, Richard?
The last piece was finished about 8 weeks before he died. It's a piano trio, a set of short movements for piano trio, his only piano trio. It was edited by his colleagues after and he had started yet another song. He wrote a lot of music in his late years. He started another song. And Virgil said, "I just feel like if I had handled things better, I could have had him for another year." And I said, "Virgil, do not do that to yourself. Thank you for all you did do." Right?
Do you keep writing whether or not you have a performance or a commission or somebody wanting to? Do you have a performance in mind before you write it, or are you just writing anyway?
Most of the time, I just write what I want to write. Sometimes these days now, I actually get requests. I wrote an organ piece for a friend on commission about 3 years ago. And there's that Welsh baritone, Jeremy Williams, who heard the Bowers Fader duo performance of my 2 songs and wrote to me and said, would you write something for me? You know, so I wrote in January of this year, I wrote him a song, which he says is beautiful. And we're trying to work together something with NACUSA-LA so that he can come out to Los Angeles and do a concert for us.
Mhm.